This conference will now be recorded.
So yes, we are recording this webinar so that we can load it into eCommunity for other people who are not able to join today. My name is Pam Goodell. I am the Senior Marketing Director at the at ITE, and today is our first of what could be several weeks of virtual drop-ins. Today, Peter Yauch from ITE, will be presenting, and he will present for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we will open it up to conversation. If you have not already, please do 2 things in terms of housekeeping. For your audio, please make sure that if you're on your computer, you've selected computer audio. If you're on your phone, select phone call, and that's on your control panel under audio, and that's so that we can see your smiling face. Please select your webcam and select the button. It looks like a camera to the right on your control panel. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Peter, and we'll have a small presentation, short presentation.
Right. Yep. Thank you, Pamela. This is a little follow-up to a couple of bills that were going through the Florida House and Senate during the last legislative session. And basically the bills were to either get rid of RRFBs entirely or to make them red in color. So a little background on it. There was a 12-year-old girl that was killed on A1A. This is the beach highway along the Atlantic Ocean in Satellite Beach, which is south of the Daytona area. And she was crossing the road, I believe it was the day after Christmas. And that has started a neighborhood push for changing out the indications on the RFBs from yellow to red. The RFBs had been installed as part of an upgrade about 6 to 8 months prior to the crash, and people were familiar with it. Their RRFBs are very popular here in Florida. They got started here in the St. Petersburg area, and Florida DOT likes to use them a lot. So Pam, if you go to the next slide, here's an indication of where the crosswalk is. The Google Earth picture is a little bit older than the crosswalk. So you can see about where that gray area is where they built the dividing island. But the crosswalk was not yet in place there. But you see it serves a little park on the ocean side. There's the beach right alongside. Pam, the next slide. There were a series of crosswalks. Now you'll see this is a 5-lane roadway. The speed limit is 45 miles per hour. Carries about 32,000 ADT. And there was a series of about 3 or 4 mid-block crosswalks along this section that were recently implemented. And starting with a sign sequence, here was this first sign for stopping for pedestrians and crosswalks. Go to the next slide. Then there was an advanced pedestrian crossing sign. Next slide. Pavement markings for ped crossing. Next slide. Stop bar, the stop here for pedestrians, and then you can see the crosswalk. Next slide. There's the crosswalk itself with a little zigzag through the median. You've got basically 3 sets of RRFB modules in each direction. So it should be pretty visible location. All right, next slide. Well, after the fatality at the crosswalk, the neighborhood got together, and there was a real push of people saying that yellow was confusing. Yellow didn't mean stop. Apparently, the girl had pushed the button. Lights came on. A couple of cars came through. There seemed to be a gap, so she started across, and the car that hit her did not stop at the crosswalk. So some press coverage, and they apparently got to the legislative representatives from that area, and that started 2 bills. Next slide. The bill that had the most action was Florida House Bill 1371. And the initial requirements as originally written was that all mid-block crosswalks had to be controlled by a traffic signal, red, yellow, and green with pedestrian indications. And those signals all had to be installed by October 1st of 2024. And any crosswalks that did, any mid-block crosswalks that did not have signals had to be removed. An identical bill was entered into the Florida Senate. That was Senate Bill 1000. I'm not going to talk about that because that pretty much got hung up in committee. But the House bill continued through several committees, all getting unanimous votes until it got to the open House floor. And the final requirements were that you could use yellow RRFBs on 2-lane roads with speed limits of 35 miles per hour or less. All other locations had to be removed by October 1st of 2024, but could be replaced by other legally accepted equipment. Now that seemed to be a watering down. That was not a requirement for traffic signal, but it could be just signs if it's legally accepted equipment. It doesn't say that it had to be lighted. Florida DOT was to request Federal Highway Administration to permit red RRFBs for crosswalks. There was an addition there to put an informational sign that was required to face pedestrians. Well, there was a sign that was facing pedestrians already that said push button to activate warning lights. And then finally, another addition was to say that all crosswalks had to be based on a traffic engineering study by a Florida PE. And I would say that everything on the state highway system already is. So not really sure the intent of that. When this went to the open floor, it was passed unanimously -1. Don't know who voted against it, but it was basically through the House, got hung up in the Senate. If the Senate had approved it, they would have had to work together to get common language for the governor to sign it. So it died in the legislative process when the session ended a couple of weeks ago. But it raises some issues. I had posted on ITE community a little bit of this background and had some interesting comments from some other folks about their happiness with the RFB design. Like I said, it's real popular here. Our yielding rates in Florida are generally 80 to 85% or more. And maybe that's the first question. And Pam, if you want to close out the slide there, we can open up more windows or people. And I guess maybe the start of the discussion is, have others seen similar initiatives around their parts of the country?
Pete, this is Rudy. When the
Rudy?
RRFP at Federal Highway Administration was running through its stuff, I thought we were looking at 2-lane roads at 35 miles an hour as a recommended, and that was just discussions, and that goes back 10 years or so. And I know that Florida went to 4 lanes and went to 45 miles an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an issue? And also on the informational sign, did the informational sign say cross when appropriate or cross when safe at the bottom?
I think the push button sign said push button to activate warning lights. It didn't have anything else on it about wait for vehicles to stop, anything like that.
I think the recommended or the sign that I've seen is cross when safe to do so, or it really, you push the button and then you're supposed to cross when you feel it's safe to cross.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what the Florida MUTCD says on that, but I thought that on a national basis we had on there. And when I worked with Peter on that, I thought we had those on the bottom of the signs. So those are the two things: the speed and the number of lanes were 2 lanes, 35 miles an hour in the development area. And then again, I moved on before it was approved, but then the informational sign also would be facing and saying that you had to basically, it's your responsibility, pedestrian, to cross when clear. That's how it is in Wisconsin, that particular sign. But they do have it on 45 miles an hour and multi-lane roads. And it's just what it is. I wasn't real keen about multi-lane roads. I just thought it was very good what St. Pete did originally for 2-lane roads, but others thought differently.
We have a lot of them on the 4-lane divided or the 5-lane roadways. I think there's even a couple on 6-lane that is pushing it, but they went with overhead indications and advanced indications on those. But even if you look at FHWA's website and search for RRFBs, the informational sheet that comes up, the image shows a 5-lane roadway with post-mounted RRFBs. How about any others?
Again, it moved on from what those of us that are more conservative with it. And the original design, remember the original design in St. Pete was on 2-lane roads, local roads, lower speeds, and that was the original intent. And then then there was one at Sunken Gardens.
Mm-hmm.
How many lanes is Sunken Gardens?
That's a 5-lane roadway there, and they've had a fatality in that crosswalk.
Yeah, okay. So this is Pam. Just a quick reminder to everybody who is on the phone or may have joined late. All of you should be unmuted unless you've muted yourself. So feel free to ask a question or make a comment. I don't need to ask the question for you or make the comment. You can do it yourself. And also please share your webcam by clicking the camera-like icon on your control panel. If you feel more comfortable, oh, sorry, go ahead.
This is Marvin. Peter, sorry to hear about that. It's very unfortunate that something like that happened. But it sounds like to me in a situation like this where it was 4 lanes of traffic, right? 2 in each direction.
Right.
4 lanes of traffic, and you said the speed was 45. I can't imagine what the 85th is, but it does sound like you would need something more than just RRFBs. You essentially would need like a red light, something to really stop vehicles, like something like a pedestrian hybrid beacon even. And for a beach area, it sounds like you would have a lot of vulnerable users too. And so a 12, 10-year-old, they can't perceive traffic the same way we do. And so I think if you are going to use a push button, it would have to be motion censored, and you can't expect them to push it and then judge traffic and cross safely on their own. And it sounds like that's what happened in this situation too. And from where I'm from in Pennsylvania, we actually can't use the pedestrian hybrid beacon. And so I'm just curious if it's the same way in Florida too.
We have some of the pedestrian hybrid or hawk signals here. With our wind loading design, mast arms get to be very expensive down here. And so the RFB was looked at as being a much more economical solution.
Mm-hmm. And I looked real quick too. So for the FHWA, they have the Guide for Improving Pedestrian Safety, and they've got a nice table. And I wish I could share my screen and show you, but they got this nice table, and it based on your speed and the number of lanes you have, it gives you the countermeasures you should use at this crossing. And it does have on here pedestrian hybrid beacon should always be considered in this type of situation.
Mm-hmm. All right. Anyone else have comments?
Yes, I have a question from somebody. Would the 2-lane requirement also include a 4-lane divided by a refuge island?
Well, whenever you try to interpret legislation, you really don't have a clue what they meant to do. I would say that they were looking at it as being a 2-lane roadway, which perhaps is a 3-lane roadway. So 1 lane moving in each direction. But that was not spelled out in any clarity in the legislation.
This is Mark. I'm calling in from Montana, where we're probably not what you would call early adapters, but we did recently do an installation of an RRFB, and the language on the sign mounted over the push button simply says, push button to turn on warning lights. It seems to me that should be expanded on to go on to say, and wait for traffic to stop. Just because you push the button doesn't mean you have the right of way yet. Until traffic actually stops, it's not safe to go. So I think expanding upon that probably would be wise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is the actual
language.
That's the actual language that's in the interim approval that you just read, which is push button to turn on warning lights.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and
Randy.
this may be a follow-up comment to this. It's by someone. Not everybody has the technology to ask a question, so I'm facilitating where I can. This person indicates we had a request many years ago from a council member to go to red flashers. We went with the MUTCD as prohibiting.
This is Mike from Seattle. I can't help but think how this whole story seems to have very similar aspects to how the pedestrian hybrid beacon was developed. And I'm sure Richard Dassey from Tucson could probably tell. But I remember at the time when I was down there, Tucson at the time had a number of just yellow flashing lights, like I'm sure a lot of cities where you had a overhead crosswalk sign and then the flashing yellow, which is pedestrian activated. At the time that they had started to do something a little bit more intense, they put a 4-foot by 4-foot blank out sign at the time, and it said "Stop for pedestrians and crosswalk," and it flashed red, kind of in a wig-wag. They had a post mount one and then an overhead location, and unfortunately at one of these locations it was a 6-lane road. Speed limit, I believe the speed limit was 40 miles per hour. Is one of the major roads in Tucson, and a young woman about 16, a girl, was riding her bike, and she had pushed the button. The first 2 lanes had stopped, and she was riding her bike across the crosswalk, and unfortunately the 3rd lane did not stop, and it resulted in a fatality. And so it kind of it's interesting. These two seem very parallel in the whole story of it. Yeah, I mean, and I know Tucson, for example, is last time I was down there, I think it's only a handful of RRFBs, and I don't know if it's just because of the nature of the driving down there, which is typically probably pretty more aggressive, in the southern Arizona region, kind of a little bit more motor vehicle based than pedestrian based, and the requirement for having a red requirement on that one there. So just thought I'd mention that.
One thing for the group to think about from ITE's perspective is there's no shortage of tables and research that are out there. Charlie Zagier, Kay Fitzpatrick, both have done substantial work in this area. But I think from the industry standpoint, having some clear standard of care for the migration from 25 to 35 to 45, from the migration of 1 lane to 2 lanes to 3 lanes, and being a little bit more clear about the options, about what's the standard of care. And if somebody wants to use something that's not the standard of care in one of the crossovers, then they need to study it pretty thoroughly. But I know the research that Kay has done recently with the pedestrian hybrid beacon and the use of the red signal indications on the higher speed and the stop or yield ratios are substantively different than they are for RFB. So I think we're getting to the point where it's probably time for us to start just laying down the basic standard of care so that users don't step into cross applications so easily. Because if you look at the Zagir table, you can use almost anything. There's like 10 options for many of those little squares. I don't think more options is going to help people at the end of the day. And so I think we need to start thinking about what is it that we need to put down. And some of this may need to be worked out with the national committee as to figuring out what those parameters are for application.
This is Rudy.
I'm
I
curious.
totally agree. I totally agree with that. It really needs to have a little more study. I was involved with the MUTCD in the early development of that, and I think it's grown. To me, it's the engineers have found, and I use this example when I taught the pedestrian safety course. When an engineer gets a new tool like a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So this was a great tool, and it just really expanded beyond what I originally had envisioned. But I moved on to other areas, and other people took over. So, but the original vision was lower speed. And I think we should have the National Committee look at that and come up with some specific guidelines.
A question. Could you bring up the Google image of the location?
This one?
Yes, that one. Thank you. Now, with it appears that there's actually a trail of some sort that comes right from that location and goes to the beach. Now,
Yes.
was this a location where there was actually people crossing? Do you know?
I don't know the history of it now.
Because it almost appears that it would be. If you're looking to the away from the ocean, it looks like you have homes, you have some parking lots and stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what I'm just curious, because at times because we have a location. I'm located up in Buffalo, New York. We have a location where we're looking at trying to improve pedestrian safety, and we did a vehicle count with cameras, and this location currently has nothing. It's but it's right by the University of Buffalo, and off to the west there's a number of apartment buildings and houses that have student housing. So ignoring the fact that people aren't, ignoring the fact that people are already crossing there doesn't seem to be a solution either. And
Yeah.
they're crossing at that location now with nothing, with no type of warning, with no type of protection. It's a 4-lane, well, it's a 5-lane, but it has a raised median now. But they're actually standing out at the toe of the median, waiting to cross.
Hmm.
I think it points, Paul, to a need for, particularly the sensitivity of the need when we get situations 5 and more lanes and land uses on adjacent sides, and where land use is allowed on one side that creates either unintentional or intentional demand for crossing a significant roadway facility.
So a question has come in. At these locations, it would appear PHBs would be better than RRFBs. This person contacted FHWA last month about the PHB requirement not to be in or near an intersection. Unfortunately, appears they are waiting for the next MUTCD update rather than acting on the NCU TCD recommendation. Does anyone have any updates?
I don't have anything.
There's at this point, what the National Committee has put up on their website is a recommendation to FHWA, but it is not, it has no standing without either being an interim approval or incorporation into a new update of the MUTCD, or if an agency wants to go with experimentation through FHWA. Those would be the options.
I'm curious whether the group has any initial reaction to the idea of switching from yellow lights to red lights, whether you see an intrinsic advantage or maybe a reason not to do that. Does it too closely resemble flashing lights at a railroad crossing or something else? But just curious what the group wisdom is on that switch in color.
I think if we go that direction, we're essentially creating a shoulder-mounted hawk. You're gonna have to. Don Bennett here. Sorry, I don't have a video. Yeah. You're gonna have to have a clearance interval or a change interval in there, and a clearance interval. So, I mean, for us, I'm kind of in Pete's boat there with regard to coastal wind zones. The difference between an RRFB and a hawk for us would be something between going from a $30,000 treatment to a $300,000 treatment.
Yep.
Yeah.
This is Aaron from Carmen. I will mention, I think earlier, maybe it was Pete or somebody said, have they heard about the request for red RFBs before? And as a manufacturer of these products, it does come up. And I can think specifically of a court case in Illinois, where that was one of the things that was brought forward was, why not just take the yellow RFB and replace it with a red RFB, and that would fix all the problems. So this is, and again, we're intimately involved in a lot of projects in every state and province. So it does come up periodically, but the Florida example is the most recent one.
There has been some experimentation in Florida using red RFBs for wrong way locations on ramps.
Yeah, and that's there's probably, I think there's 18 states that are doing experimentation with red light bars for wrong way driver. So there's other, obviously there's a lot going on in that area as well. I did want to comment one thing about the sign. You know, I believe the common standard in Florida is the R1025. It's the push button to turn on warning lights. And that's been kind of the standard crosswalk sign for the pedestrian since the St. Petersburg tests. I guess my humble opinion, I can't back it up with a lot of data, is I think that sign needs some improvement. I know recently I was in Texas and I saw they had added little supplemental plaques to it that said, you know, push button to turn on warning lights, and then had a thing saying, warning, vehicles may not stop. You know, it had additional information there. Obviously, sometimes you can go with an audible push button station or accessible push button station. So if you push the button, at least you can read up more information, such as, I think fundamentally you're saying you're turning on the warning lights, but you're entering into a hazardous area and vehicles may not stop. But the sign right now, the standard is, it's very basic. It just says push button to turn on warning lights.
This is Garrett up in Newfoundland. We've been working with our Canadian National Institute for the Blind and recently just putting our first audible message at enhanced crosswalk, use yellow flashers. And the message that we went with after several back and forth was that after kind of that 3-second delay to get the audible message rather than the typical cross is yellow lights flashing, cross with caution, and that's repeated a couple of times.
So this is Pam. We are getting, it is just about 3:30. I don't want to wrap up this conversation prematurely if people still have something to say. I do have one more question in the queue. And then I have one personal observation. I'm not a transportation professional, but my observation first and then the question. So I do think from my personal observation, I was down in Jacksonville not too long ago, and we were traveling down A1A, and I think there's a unique situation that this does, it is a route to cross to get to the ocean. And so while there were RRFBs at the crosswalk, there were also pails attached to all of the signs with red flags in the pails. And people were supposed to take a flag, and as they crossed the street, they were supposed to wave the flag. I took pictures of them. I thought that was interesting. But I do think there's that unique situation with this road because it does bring residential people to the ocean. So I think there are a lot of people who cross the street wherever they can, or even at the crosswalk to get to the ocean. That's just a personal observation. Not sure that it's the right one to make, but one of the last questions for this drop-in is, if the yellow are made into red, would a regulatory sign be required instead of the warning signs?
I would think so, yes.
I would think if we're going to red, we've pretty much made it a signal at that point. So the question is, why are we not putting a signal in if we're going to a red display? Red means stop. I guess for everybody to think about, why would you not install signal at that point? It's just the pedestrian crossing signal at that. Once it goes red, it's a signal. So why are we overthinking this? You know. And the other problem becomes is a post-mounted RRFB that's red can easily be blocked by a truck. I don't know if you can, without it being a signal, I don't think you can get the display without spending the 300,000 or 500,000 or how many 100,000 without it being a signal and being placed on a mast arm. So it may be, again, the standard of care when you get into that 40, 45 or above zone is maybe it's either a PHB or a signal in a progressive step, and that's it. It's not an RFB that's red.
I would I'd second that. I would also caution us though not to think that the overall signal is a panacea.
Mm-hmm.
I've investigated at least 2 pedestrian fatalities. One of the most disturbing ones that I investigated was a lady and her 3-year-old going from a housing facility over to a Department of Social Services, crossing a 3-lane one-way road. First 2 lanes were stopped at the red. She pushed the button as the side street went to yellow. She then proceeded to run across the street, and the 3rd lane got the green before she got there, and both she and her 3-year-old daughter were killed. The most chilling part of it was in the witness statement from the witness who said that she pushed the button on yellow and then ran in, was that the cycle after the incident, the walk light came up. We can't eliminate everything, but there's always going to be that system failure we can't account for, and that one still haunts me to this day.
You know, in situations like that, the design of a pedestrian signal separate from a traffic control signal is where the stop line gets placed in situations like that. And with the stop line placement in advance, having that be context sensitive to speed, because in a situation like that, if the stop line is at the crossing and it's reasonably high speed, there's no again, you can't, the pedestrian doesn't want to die, but they have no ability to see the vehicle coming. And so by setting the stop line back for pedestrian signals is another thing that probably, and we just have the 20 to 50 feet, but we don't have it context sensitive to speed. It seems as though, you know, we have the ability to figure those physics out.
I just make a note, the pedestrian crossing was on the downstream side So the being that there was a 3-lane road, the 3-lane 2-way that was run parallel to her direction of traffic, the stop line would have been about 40 to 45 feet uphill.
Yeah, I agree with what Randy and Don just said too. In this situation, I think you do need to look at either you move that crossing to that intersection and potentially make it a signalized intersection, or you have to spend that extra money, consider your hybrid beacons, consider traffic calming, road diets. I mean, to me, looking at this, it just looked like there was a flaw in design initially. You know, you have a great asset like an oceanfront, and you got all those residences there and probably even hotels, but then you separate and you create this barrier in between the residences and the oceanfront. And so now residents and visitors living there, you're kind of forced, you see something in front of you, you should be able to just walk to it easily. But you've got this road that's acting like a river and preventing you from getting there safely. So unless you design like even a pedestrian bridge or a pedestrian tunnel, it's too high speed to just use RRFBs and crosswalks, in my opinion.
I'd say one thing here, although we identified a very well-worn path to the beach that appears to have a dune walkover on the ocean side of it, apparently this location was heavily used enough that there is a goat path running through the shrubbery right about where that crossing device was placed. So there was already a defined public demand. The question is to prohibit that crossing, you'd have to put a physical barrier in place to keep the pedestrian from crossing at the undesired location. I'll use an example. We had a 4-lane divided 50-mile-an-hour high school across from a large commercial shopping center with a McDonald's. Previous staff before my arrival here installed an 8-foot chain link fence. I physically watched a high schooler walk out of the school, climb the fence, go over the top, climb down the other side, and cross the road.
Wow.
You know, at some point we're going to run out of tools, and that's one of the things that I had posted in response to the Pete's posting on the community. I'm a little concerned after 30 years of this, of watching the effectiveness of the tools that I do have to do my job, wither in compliance on both sides of the coin, both from the pedestrian standpoint and from the vehicular standpoint. You know, the MUTCD says it has to command respect, and that command of respect is subjective to the call of the person using the system.
Right, that's a good point you bring up, Don. I mean, as engineers, you only have so many tools you can use. That's why you have the 3 E's. You know, you have engineering, education, and enforcement. You know, you do your part, and there's only so much you can engineer with it, but you have to educate the pedestrians as well. You have to educate the drivers, and you might have to step up enforcement.
This is H. I mean, I agree with everything that you guys are saying. It's I've gone through a couple of situations in Florida on this. We had a location in the capital city where we actually did the education with enforcement, and the pedestrians blatantly crossed when they weren't supposed to in front of a cop. It's what can we control? It's just engineering. It's at some point, how do we control the behavior that everyone is doing and wanting to comply with it? But literally, we had 6 patrol officers on motorcycles sitting at all corners, and the people crossed right in front of them. And they gave them tickets. And then they still did it again. And then finally, the secretary at the time put a fence in front of their door, so they couldn't even come out at their door and cross wherever they wanted.
But the example that was mentioned previously about the high school and the shopping center with the McDonald's is, well, you say somebody is not thinking in terms of proper land use. If you put a high school on one side of the road and a McDonald's on the other side of the road, you can presume that you will create demand. So right off the bat, that's creating kind of an impossible situation.
Except that there were 2 holes in the fence, Both were at signalized intersections and both had pedestrian accommodations.
Thanks for the extra information.
Yeah, that's the things that make me pull my hair out. Lost track of my train of thought there for a minute.
So it's about 3:45. This is a really great conversation, and I really am loath to end it. But I do want to honor, that we are doing 30-minute drop-ins, and this recording will be posted on eCommunity. If we would like to, you can continue it on the community forum, or if somebody would like to nominate Pete for coming back sometime next week, so we can continue this conversation, or if somebody here would like to continue the conversation, please let me know and we can do that. But I'm going to wrap up the call now. Thank you all for joining the first ITE virtual drop-in. I hope you enjoyed your time today, and we look forward to seeing you on a future one. So you can all end the call now.
If you have
Bye,
a topic
everyone.
that you're interested in, you're encouraged to join in as a lead on any of these topics going forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, man.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you all.